"You weren't on the guest list, old man." That's what the usher muttered when Walter Hayes arrived at the chapel, early, quiet, and wearing the only suit he owned, pressed flat, olive green, threadbare at the shoulders. He didn't respond. Just stood still by the oak doors with a paper-wrapped box in one hand and a cane in the other, waiting patiently as guests swept past him in lace and tailored tuxedos, laughing like the day belonged only to them. And when a bridesmaid finally asked if he was lost, he simply nodded once toward the altar and whispered, "I'm just here to make sure she's not alone." She didn't know what that meant. Not yet. And neither did anyone else, not the photographers who angled their cameras away from him, not the groom's college buddies already sipping champagne in the foyer, and certainly not the sharply dressed guest who let out a short, cruel laugh and said, "Seriously? What decade is that thing from?" As Walter slowly took his seat in the very last row. But the story didn't start there. Not really. It started with a promise made 17 years earlier, under a porch light during a thunderstorm, to a little girl in muddy shoes who had just asked him if he'd be there when her dad couldn't be. And now here he was, a man they mistook for a stranger, clutching that promise like a medal no one could see. If you agree that dignity doesn't need diamonds to shine, like and subscribe, because this story will remind you why quiet honor still matters. The church swelled with the sounds of strings and soft chatter, polished guests finding their rows, cell phones tucked into designer clutches. Walter adjusted his sleeve cuff and kept his gaze fixed forward, blinking once at the floral arch that framed the empty aisle. He wasn't dressed like the others, no tuxedo, no boutonniere, just a faded army service suit worn soft by decades and memory, and polished boots that once crossed deserts, not dance floors. A few of the younger guests kept glancing back at him, not curious, not kind, just confused. Like maybe someone's great-uncle had wandered into the wrong ceremony. One of them, a man named Trent, leaned over to a bridesmaid and chuckled loud enough to be heard across the pews. "But he thinks this is a Memorial Day potluck." She laughed, then bit her lip, unsure. Walter didn't flinch. He never did. He just reached into his coat pocket and ran his thumb over a folded photo worn, taped, and creased from being read more times than any Bible. In the picture, a young girl stood on a swing set, arms raised in triumph. Behind the camera, a man in uniform had promised, "I'll walk you down the aisle one day, sweetheart, or I'll send the only man I'd trust to do it for me." That little girl was Maya, the bride. And the man behind the camera was her father, Captain Jonathan Reese, deployed again and again until one day, he didn't come home at all. But Walter had. Every birthday, every scraped knee, every graduation. Not loud, not flashy. Just there. And now, 17 years later, he was here again, and visible to most, but not to her. Not to the girl who had once asked if medals could cry. Up front, the groomsmen were getting into position, and someone in a headset whispered, "The bride's father just called. Weather delay. He's stuck in Frankfurt. Won't make it." Guests fluttered down the rows like falling petals. And somewhere near the vestibule, Maya stopped mid-step, veil in hand, tears brimming as she realized what was missing. But then she turned and asked only one question. "Is Walter here?" The wedding coordinator blinked, startled. "Who?" Maya repeated it, louder. "Is Walter Hayes here?" Word traveled fast. Too fast. By the time the back doors opened again, and Walter rose from the last pew, slowly, with the kind of poise that doesn't need announcement, the entire chapel had fallen silent. Not out of reverence. Not yet. Out of confusion. Whispers. Murmurs. Until Maya stepped forward, radiant and trembling, and took his arm without hesitation. "You made it," she whispered. Walter looked at her, not the dress, not the flashbolts, just her eyes. "I said I would." And when they turned toward the aisle, something shifted. People rose to their feet. Not because tradition demanded it, but because reverence finally did. And the guest who had scoffed just minutes before, Trent, sank into his chair and stared as the old man in the out-of-place uniform walked like someone who still remembered how to carry weight the rest of the room had never known. Walter didn't walk fast. He didn't need to. Every step was deliberate. Every breath was a memory. Every glance was a promise kept in full view of those who never saw it coming. And the chapel, once buzzing with judgment, was now holding its breath. They didn't clap. They didn't cheer. They just stood, hundreds of eyes locked on a man whose name they hadn't known an hour ago, whose presence had been a punchline, a wrinkle in the fabric of a picture-perfect ceremony. But now, as Walter Hayes stepped with deliberate care down the aisle beside the tearful bride, silence stretched thick enough to hold a lifetime of regret, and none heavier than the one wrapped around Trent's neck like a tightening collar. It was in the way Walter moved, not fast, not grand, but steady, as though the ground beneath him remembered every battlefield he'd crossed, and now rose just enough to ease his burden one last time. Maya leaned on him not because she needed help walking, but because it was always him who showed up when others couldn't. She didn't look at the crowd, didn't wave to the camera phones or the Annies mouthing "Oh my God." She kept her gaze forward and whispered, "I wish Dad could see this." Walter didn't answer right away. Then, with a softness forged in loss, he murmured, "He does." Behind them, a single click of a camera shutter echoed through the nave like thunder. The photographer lowered her lens, stunned, not by the bride, but by the man whose steps told a story no lens could capture. The truth is, no one really knew who Walter Hayes was, except maybe Maya. Not the florist who had asked if he was just waiting for a ride, not the groom's cousin who had giggled at his mismatched socks, not even the officiant who hadn't been told the plan had changed. But when they reached the altar and the music faded, the weight of that moment became a sermon in itself. The minister cleared his throat and said, "Who gives this woman away?" Walter looked directly into Maya's eyes, his voice unwavering, low, but clear enough to part the air. "On behalf of the man who gave everything and the ones who never came home, I do." The words didn't land like a line. They landed like truth. No one moved. Even the groom swallowed hard, blinking back something deeper than nerves. Maya kissed Walter on the cheek, then whispered, "Stay close." But he shook his head gently. "You don't need me now," he said. "You've got this." He turned and took his place in the second row this time, not the last, and when he sat down, the groom's mother did something no one expected. She reached over and placed her hand on his. No words. Just contact. Behind her, a young man removed his hat. Somewhere in the back, Trent was no longer laughing. He kept shifting in his seat, the smile long gone, the drink in his hand now warm and forgotten. When the ceremony ended and guests poured into the garden courtyard for cocktails, conversation swirled like wind. Who was he? Did you see the medals in his shadow box? I heard he saved her family during a flood or something. But Maya's mother, finally exhaling, told the truth. Told them how Walter had carried Maya on his shoulders when she broke her ankle in 3rd grade. How he fixed their fence when her father's orders ran long. How he stood guard at the casket when Jonathan was laid to rest and promised through gritted teeth, "As long as I'm breathing, she's never alone." And he kept that promise so quietly, so completely, that most of the world had never noticed. Until today. By the time they reached the reception hall, Walter was already seated again, back near the corner, near the exit, where men like him always choose to sit. Close enough to watch, far enough not to interfere. But Maya saw. She always had. And when it came time for the father-daughter dance, the DJ faltered. Froze. The track loaded, but the bride was missing. A murmur rippled. Then the spotlight shifted, not to the center, but toward the edge. Maya walked across the polished dance floor in full silence and extended her hand. "May I have this dance, Sergeant?" Walter didn't answer with words. He just rose, slow, but proud. They moved to the center, and the lights dimmed until it was just them. No dry eyes. No more laughter from Trent, who now looked like he was wishing for any corner of the room to swallow him whole. The music began, not something trendy, but a soft swing number from decades past, and Walter, with a hand as steady as if time had forgotten him, twirled the bride like a promise fulfilled. Around them, the crowd leaned forward, not to watch, but to witness. Not a stunt. Not a moment for social media. A legacy, being honored by the only person who'd ever truly known it was there. At the end of the song, as Maya hugged him close, she whispered something into Walter's ear that made his shoulders stiffen slightly, then relax. She stepped back. "Tell them," she said. "They deserve to know." He shook his head. "They don't need to know who I was." She smiled through her tears. "But I think today, they finally see who you are." And when he returned to his seat, this time every table he passed gave him a nod. Not the kind you give to the elderly. The kind you give to someone who just taught you how to be better. He didn't stay for cake. Didn't wait for the bouquet toss, or the sparkler send-off, or the endless rounds of clinking glasses and champagne toasts. Walter Hayes never needed a spotlight to know where he stood, and when the first dance was done and the applause had faded into polite conversation, he slipped out the side doors of the reception hall and into the cool evening air, unnoticed by all but one. Maya saw. From the corner of the tent, past cousins and chatter and silver platters, she saw him place the photo of her father back into his coat pocket, straighten the edge of his collar, and walk toward the parking lot with the same slow dignity he had entered with. She followed him. Quietly. No fanfare. Just a whisper of lace and gravel. You always leave before the lights come on, she said, her voice soft behind him. Walter stopped, turned. In the golden hue of the hanging lanterns, his age showed more clearly, creases in his brow, eyes slightly glassy from memory more than drink. Too many parties into noise, he said. I prefer the quiet part. She smiled through her tears. There wouldn't have been a ceremony without you. He shook his head. You were always going to walk that aisle. I just held the door open. But then she did something he hadn't expected. She opened the paper-wrapped box he had carried with him all day. Inside was a folded flag, a tarnished rank insignia, and a small velvet pouch. She held it out. You were supposed to give this to me when I turned 18. I waited. You didn't. Walter's face changed then, not dramatically, just a small flinch. Didn't think it was time, he said. You were still learning who you were. Maya stepped closer, pressed the box back into his chest. And now I know. Because of you. And then, before he could say anything, the chapel bells rang once, an echo into the dark, followed by the slow hush of music from inside, like even the celebration paused to hear what came next. Walter sat on a bench just outside the chapel doors, cane resting against one knee, and finally, let out a long breath that had waited 17 years to be exhaled. Maya sat beside him, not as a bride, but as the little girl who once called him the man who never lets go. She asked the question she hadn't dared to ask before. Do you ever miss it? He didn't ask what she meant, just nodded slowly. Every day. But not the war. Not the medals. Just the part where people knew what it meant to show up. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The stars stretched above them like ribbons, and distant laughter rolled like waves from the reception tent. Finally, Maya stood. I left something for you, she said. Check your seat. And then she disappeared back into the swirl of family, champagne, and garter tosses. Walter stayed there a moment longer, then stood, steadied himself, and returned to the reception. His table was empty now, the plates cleared. But in his place was a small framed photo, the swing set photo. And next to it, a single-place card with his name and Maya's handwriting. Below it, a note, not guest, guardian. And beside that, another item, his shadow box. The one he hadn't opened since 1972. It had been removed from its glass. The metals polished. The letter from General Keyes, now framed, visible to all. And taped beneath it in Maya's elegant script, a final message. This is who walked me down the aisle. This is who never left. That night, as the music finally faded and the guests poured into cars and vans and sleepy Ubers, people left the hall a little different. No one talked about the food. No one talked about the DJ. They talked about the man in the olive green suit. Someone had Googled his name during dinner. They learned he had earned the Bronze Star with valor, had led a recovery team in the Karingal Valley, had trained dozens of officers who still serve today. Someone else whispered that he once stood guard for 48 hours during a flood zone evacuation when everyone else had given up. But Walter never mentioned those things. He never once stood up and said, "Here's who I am." He let Maya do that. And she did. Not with a speech. Not with tears. But with the kind of honor that can only be taught by someone who never asked to be honored. And long after the lanterns were dimmed, and the chairs were folded, and the rented suits were returned, one image remained in everyone's mind, not the dress, not the vows, not the photos, but the sight of an old man, rising slowly from the back row, and walking arm in arm with a bride who never needed reminding of who her real escort was. Because some weddings are remembered for flowers, and others for food. But this one? This wedding was remembered because someone finally recognized the quiet legacy that had been sitting at the edge of every important moment, all along.